Yo, what's this guy doing? I don't know, let's go check it out. Hey, what are you doing?
I'm waiting for the bus.
What's in the bag?
None of your business.
What are you drinking?
Soda? What are you doing? No!
Yeah.
Why? No!
Yeah.
Stop!
Hello, Bruce. How are you doing?
Well, honestly, this week has been awful. The police officer who assaulted me still has not faced any charges, and it is outrageous how intolerant the criminal and justice system really is.
Well, Bruce, why do you think that the cop, as you explained, assaulted you?
Well, I honestly think he assaulted me because of discrimination. I believe he stereotyped me because of the negative stereotypes associated with minorities. I was just sitting on the street while waiting for the bus because I always go into the city every day for my daily job. I guess the police officers thought I was going to commit a crime or something. I don't get it, but that's the only thing that I could think of right now.
Interesting. And what flaws do you think exist in the criminal and justice system?
I absolutely think that the criminal and justice system is flawed because of the narrow negative stereotypes that many white officers have towards minorities. In addition, I know through the news that African Americans and minorities in general receive longer sentences than white people for committing the same crime. White privileges should not be involved in any part of society, as the United States bases its foundation off of the idea of equality. However, clearly the system does not support equality because of white privileges over minorities.
Hello, sir. Good. How are you? Good. Reason I pulled you over, your brake lights are out. So you only have one active brake light, and that's going to be your passenger side one. Your third brake light, which is up here on top, and then this one back here, is going to be out. You have your license and insurance?
I have to tell you, I do have a firearm on me.
Don't reach for it then. Don't pull it out.
I'm not pulling it out.
Don't pull it out.
You just killed my boy. He wasn't me.
Don't pull it out.
He wasn't.
Don't move.
Oh, man. Oh, my
Don't move.
Oh, my
Don't
God.
move.
Oh, my God. I'm shaking.
Don't move.
Don't move, baby.
Code 3. Get the baby girl out of here.
53 new videos show Sacramento police officers racing to the scene after reports of shots fired.
Everybody good? Everybody good?
Body cam footage shows a third officer approaching two officers in somebody's backyard moments after Stephon Clark is shot.
You have a gun?
While Clark is lying motionless on the ground, there's confusion about whether he has a gun or if he's even alive.
Police department, can you hear us?
We need to know if you're okay. We can't go over there to get you help unless we know you don't have a weapon.
Minutes later, officers approach Clark and cuff him before performing CPR.
No pulse, no breathing?
No.
While officers search the crime scene for evidence, other teams responding try to explain what's happening to neighbors.
And we heard gunshots.
Yeah, there's somebody shot at off.
Take your hands out of your pockets now.
I got stuff in my hand.
What started as one officer engaging with a black man over a routine parking violation turns violent in an instant.
Taser, taser, taser!
Milwaukee Bucks player Sterling Brown tased on the ground, surrounded by police officers, all in a matter of minutes. The incident caught on police body cameras. For many, this once again highlights the everyday dangers faced by black men in this country. The incident began in the early morning hours of January 26th. According to the police report, an officer from the Milwaukee Police Department was doing a business check at a Walgreens on the south side of Milwaukee. He then spotted a Mercedes parked horizontally across two handicapped spaces. In the officer's report, the driver of that car was Sterling Brown.
How you doing? You got a driver's license? Where's that? Where's your driver's license? Back up. You don't see the issue here? Hold on.
Don't touch me.
You don't see the issue here. You're not parked across 3 lanes?
That's cool. That's cool.
The officer then calls for backup.
Can't get another squad here.
According to the police report, the officer asks Brown repeatedly to step back, but Brown refuses, becoming, quote, very aggressive.
What's your name?
It's on there.
But in the body cam video, Brown appears calm.
These are simple questions, man.
No, I'm answering.
These are
I
simple
ain't got
questions,
no problem,
and you're being all bad asking me, all right? These are legitimate questions, right?
I ain't got no problem with it.
Okay, well, you look at me like I got something growing out of my head, all right?
I'm just saying you touched me. That's the issue. That's
Right,
my
because you
initial
got up
issue.
in my face, okay?
I got up in your face.
Right.
Really.
I asked you to
Come
back
on, bro.
up, and you
Come
did not do it. I asked you to back up, and you did not do it. You backed up about 3 inches, all right? Everything I'm doing is on camera, dude.
Then several law enforcement officers arrive on the scene,
I just wanted one.
appearing to surprise even the initial officer.
All I wanted was one extra.
The fact that so many showed up really speaks to the tone deafness of the officers on the scene, not realizing that their presence, in a way, it causes escalation. If you're going to take enforcement action on such a low-level crime like illegal parking, write the citation and be done with it.
Meanwhile, Brown is questioned by 2 other officers, the situation seemingly under control. But just a few minutes later, more officers are seen surrounding him, and then,
I got stuff in my hand.
in that police report, the officer writes that Brown, quote, physically resisted officers' attempts to handcuff him, and he was taken to the ground in a controlled manner. But the video appears to tell a very different story. Just seconds after asking Brown to take his hands out of his pockets, officers tackle him to the ground.
The report and the facts put in that arrest report don't support what we see on video, that Mr. Brown actually was just standing there complying as best he could.
The report also states, quote, a taser had to be employed to get Brown in control with handcuffs.
Taser, taser, taser!
It just boggles your mind because you wonder, how do we end up
The issue of racial targeting and police brutality, especially toward the African American community, is not a new one. Recently, there have been many examples of these types of cases, including the ones in this video: Philando Castile, Stephen Clark, and Sterling Brown. There are numerous examples of this, and this is a real issue in America today. There is a divide between the black community and the police. The feeling in the community is that police target them, and there is certainly fear between the two. This divide adds to the polarization of our country and is a small part of an underlying racism that has plagued our country since its very creation. In this video, Stephen Clark was gunned down outside of his grandmother's home in southern Sacramento in the backyard after police responded to a 911 call about a man breaking windows in a glass door. Stephen was walking out the back door of the home when police came around the side of the house. When police encountered him in the dark yard, they claimed to have thought that Mr. Clark was pointing a firearm at them, yet only a cell phone was later found by his body. No gun. 20 shots were then let off, fatally hitting Clark. This shooting led to hundreds of protesters in the streets of Sacramento calling for justice for Stephen, even shutting down the Sacramento Kings basketball game. Stephen was only 22 years old and had 2 young boys, ages 1 and 3. In this terrible shooting in St. Paul, Minnesota, the encounter between Castile and the police officer Yanez lasted only 40 seconds before 7 shots were fired on him. Philando Castile was pulled over by Officer Yanez for having a brake light off. Philando Castile was reaching for his license and registration and was required by law to let the officer know that he was carrying a concealed firearm. Yanez claims that he fired at Castile because he feared for his life and thought that Castile was reaching for his firearm before Yanez shot him. In the car with him was his girlfriend and her child. Philando Castile was then taken to the hospital where he later passed away. The case has since gone through, and Yanez was acquitted on 1 count of second-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of intentional discharge of firearm that endangers safety. In this instance, an NBA player for the Milwaukee Bucks, Sterling Brown, was tased after an altercation with police over parking in some handicapped spots in front of a Walgreens late at night. The officer asked for his license and registration and felt that Brown was getting in his face. They started talking, and only a minute into the conversation, the officer asked for backup, and even Brown questioned the officer, asking him why he couldn't figure the situation out by himself. 3 more cars arrived at the scene, and many police were seen surrounding Brown. During the confrontation, Brown was seen putting his hands in his pockets, and when the police asked him to take them out, he claimed to have had stuff in them. The officers then pulled him to the ground, and with no signs of struggling, they tased him. He was then arrested and booked, all over a parking violation. In all 3 instances, there was little to no punishment dealt out to the police officers that took part in these situations. In the Philando Castile case, the officer was nervous and quick to fire his weapon than just a regular traffic stop. Although Castile was carrying a firearm, he should have been more calm and composed. There was no need to fire off 7 shots at a man sitting in a car. However, he was charged with nothing. In the Stephen Clark shooting, an innocent man was gunned down because they targeted him and perceived him to have a firearm. Yet once again, the police involved were charged in no crime. In the Sterling Brown case, some officers were punished, but the amount was disclosed and none of them faced any criminal charges. This adds to the problem because the police that have acted wrongfully in these situations have not been properly punished for their crimes, and it demonstrates to the black community that police will be protected, even when they are seen doing inappropriate and unnecessary things in these situations.
In police brutality issues, the trust in the relationship between cops and minorities has reached a possible all-time low in modern society. The minorities, such as African Americans, feel endangered because of the threat that police impose on their lives, because recently, police have been killing innocent African Americans across the country. On the other side, the police also fear their lives as well, because they, due to their inherent stereotypes that African Americans are dangerous criminals, believe their lives are in danger for their hidden racist stereotyping of minorities and African Americans.
The criminal justice system and law enforcement in the U.S. consistently discriminates against minorities and in particular African Americans. In 2015, black males were 9 times more likely than other Americans to be killed by police. About 1 in every 65 deaths of young African American men in the U.S. is a killing by police. Also, in New York City, it was reported that 80% of the NYPD stops were of black and Latinos. When they were stopped, about 85% of them were frisked, while when whites were stopped, only about 8% of them were frisked. Additionally, in 2009, Mark Myers stated that while African Americans make up about 13% of the U.S.'s population and 14% of monthly drug users, there are 37% of the people arrested for drug offenses. All this discrimination in law enforcement creates fear in minorities towards the police. This fear causes them to distrust law enforcement. According to a poll conducted by Gallup, 48% of Americans do not have confidence in law enforcement, which is the highest percentage since 1993. The criminal justice system also discriminates against minorities. According to an article written by Erica King, black males receive on average 19.1% longer sentences than white males for committing the same crime. This is a major problem, and it clearly shows a flaw with the United States justice system. The justice system was based on the idea of fair trials for all, but that is not what is currently happening. African Americans are getting longer sentences based on the color of skin, creating a distrust with the courts. And this distrust is very warranted. Not only do minorities get longer sentences, but they also are more likely to remain in prison awaiting trial than whites are. In 1995, the New York State Division of Criminal Justice did a review of disparities in processing felony arrests, and their findings were staggering. They found that in some parts of New York, blacks were 33% more likely to be detained awaiting felony trials than whites facing the same trials.
With the issue of police brutality prominently rising throughout the United States, there must be reform in order to solve this discriminatory issue. For starters, in order to work at resolving this issue, the United States must decriminalize petty offenses that will cause minorities such as African Americans to get in more conflict with the police that they are already afraid of. For example, an African American named Irvin Edwards was arrested for simply sagging his pants, which is illegal in certain places in the United States, such as Port Allen in Los Angeles. The police arrested the man for sagging his pants, and he was later restrained, tasered, and beaten at the local jail by the police, as he also had a mental illness issue that caused the conflict. Irvin Edwards died in custody as he was left face first on the jail ground without any help. In the end, the police denied all of the offenses and did not receive any punishments. Between minorities such as African Americans and white police officers often end badly because African Americans feel defenseless and recently often fear for their lives, as white police officers act too quickly in thinking that African Americans are criminals, therefore they want to defend themselves as well. In addition, police should be tested for inherent racial bias, as many police officers feel like they are not racially biased. However, they can be discriminatory without even realizing it. In order to test for racial bias, police officers should take tests such as Project Implicit, created by Harvard University, as they have the tools to identify the racial biases within people that they may not know about. This test determines one's inner feelings about certain topics, and in this case, race, as it can determine whether cops associate minorities like African Americans with bad criminals, which would be unfit and make sense for some of their rash decisions. It can also show if one is unbiased towards minorities, such as African Americans, which would make them fit to deal with these situations. It uses one's implicit feelings towards a race by making the test taker go quick in order to see how they truly feel about a situation without thinking it over. Police officers that take the test and receive the score of neutral, as they would not prefer or associate with one race over the other, should be placed in these communities with more minorities, such as African Americans. Police officers that have more racial bias, if they score on the test to prefer or associate with white people over African Americans, should be placed in other communities that are more composed of white people. Finally, the problem is, as we see with regularity, the American police, particularly when they are around people of color, get too nervous and irrational due to stereotypes affiliated with minorities, even though they only reflect the smallest percentage of the group. White officers may feel that they must reasonably act on such feelings in ways that seem to only do with African Americans. In addition, the police killings of Tamir Rice, John Crawford, Rakia Boyd, Laquan McDonald, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, and thousands of other men and women and children were not reasonable. If the law says these killings were reasonable, then that law needs to change. We must specifically redefine what reasonable means. It is not reasonable for police to consistently think a cell phone or a wallet is a gun and kill African Americans or minorities as a result. It is not reasonable to shoot an innocent therapist while trying to calm his mentally ill patient while he pets a toy truck. It is not reasonable for that patient to be shot, particularly when his therapist is calmly and coolly explaining what is happening. We have reached a point of ridiculousness where police are always claiming to be afraid of anything and everything that they see, which is their justification of the shootings of countless of innocent African Americans and minorities. There cannot be this type of leniency within the punishments of police officers as well. Just because they are police officers does not mean they can shoot someone else due to their inner fears or stereotypes without clear justification that the other person would harm the police officer. They must serve the same punishments as regular people in society, as equality is the foundation of the United States today. These laws we now see are in need of a clear correction. They are too vague and infringe on way too many basic constitutional and human rights of decent Americans. We must change them today in these ways for the better.